Barrie Schwartz was the official documenting photographer of the Shroud of Turin research project, the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the shroud in 1978. Today he plays an influential role in shroud research and education as the editor and founder of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, and that's at www.shroud.com. The oldest, largest, and most extensive shroud research on the internet, with more than 15 million visitors from over 160 countries. In 2009, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association. And that's also on the internet. It's STERA, S-T-E-R-A.Inc., a nonprofit corporation to which he donated the website and his extensive shroud photographic collection, as well as many other important shroud resources in order to preserve and maintain these materials and make them available for future research and study. He currently serves as president of STERA Incorporated. And it's a great privilege on my behalf. Let's give a warm welcome to Barrie Schwartz.
Aren't you glad he didn't read the whole 4 pages? So am I. Anyway, it's great to be here. Thank you for making me feel very welcome. I got here and it was really cold. But I live in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. So I had my Carhartt with me anyway. But it was chilly, and of course it was so windy in Toronto yesterday that all the flights were delayed. I spent 4.5 hours extra sitting at O'Hare, waiting for a flight that could actually land in Toronto, but thank God we got here last night. So thank you so much for inviting me to come up to Canada again. Last year I was in Moncton, New Brunswick, and spent a week at a Trappist monastery, which is kind of ironic for a Jewish guy like me. As a matter of fact, before I'm finished today, I'll explain what a nice Jewish guy like me is doing so involved with probably the most important relic of Christianity. And so the first question I always get is, how did you get involved with this? And so I'm going to tell you, so you don't have to wait and ask me that later on. I'm a professional photographer, now retired, of course. I worked in Santa Barbara, California, had a studio there, and I was contracted by a local research company that was a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratories to be a photographic consultant on a project for about 7 months. Now, the younger folks might not know, but the older folks in the audience will know that Los Alamos is famous for the atomic bomb. And so for 7 months, I worked on a project about atomic bombs. And I'd love to tell you more, but it was classified. If I tell you any more, I have to kill you. There's too many of you, so we'll leave it at that. At any rate, they asked me, so I did this project. We finished the work, and just a few weeks after we completed the atomic bomb project, the gentleman called me again. Now, when you're self-employed and the phone rings, first thing you're thinking is another job. So he called me and he said, "What do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I laughed. I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." And Don laughed and he said, "So am I." Remember, he's one of the other Jewish guys on our team. And he explained to me that a couple of researchers at Sandia Laboratories, a sister lab to Los Alamos, also in New Mexico, had taken a photograph of the shroud and put it into a device called a VP8 image analyzer. No quiz at the end, so don't make notes. I'm not going to ask any questions at the end. And the VP8 just takes a black and white image, and I'm going to show you what it looks like in a few minutes. But it just takes a black and white image, and it revealed a property that had been suspected of the shroud's image, but it marked the first time that a scientific instrument itself had revealed the spatial depth, or three-dimensional, as it's often called, information that's encoded into the shroud, and that became the catalyst for the STERP team, Shroud of Turin Research Project, to be formed. And so he said, so would you like to be a part of this? And I said, no, absolutely not. And he said, well, look, before you make your mind up, let me bring you some literature and you can read what we know about the shroud. And I said, okay, but I wasn't feeling real comfortable getting involved. And so he brought me literature, which was a big stack of literature, most all of it religious tracts from the Holy Shroud Guild, a group of 4 priests in New York that had been promoting the shroud in the United States since the mid-50s. Well, that didn't help. I'm looking at all this religious information and I'm not seeing much science because no one had ever really done much science on the shroud up to that point in time. Well, the property of the image that he had explained to me, and of course he said it to me in technical terms, he said there seems to be a correlation of image density to cloth body distance. Or in other words, the closer the image was to the cloth, the darker the image is, and the further away it was, up to about 4 centimeters, the image grows more faint until it reaches extinction. Well, I knew you couldn't make a photograph that way. You can't encode that kind of information with photography or with artwork. Now we have, in the modern era, artists who have copied the image of the shroud, which of course images are readily available, and they've been able to kind of capture some of that. But imagine someone in medieval times that was going to fake the shroud would have to start from scratch, which is virtually impossible. So anyway, what I decided to do was go ahead and be a part of this team, but I'm going to be honest, because there's a priest in the room here, so I have to be honest. I was really thinking free trip to Italy. That was the extent of my depth involvement with the Shroud of Turin. I didn't know anything about it. And I'd never been to Europe, so I said, okay, I'll go. Obviously, it was more than that, but that was one of the thoughts going through my head at the time. So with that in mind, I went ahead and joined that team, and for the next 17 months, we spent our time preparing our experiments, developing the technologies that we would need, bringing on board other researchers who were specialists in the disciplines that would be necessary for that kind of an examination. Everything, of course, having to be non-destructive, meaning that nothing could cause any harm or damage to the cloth. And so that's what we did. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do today is going to, first of all, give you an introduction to the shroud, and it'll be brief. Then I'm going to take you behind the scenes of what we did in 1978 to give you a sense of what we were up against, because when you hear scientific research, you immediately think of a shiny laboratory with stainless steel or enamels. No, didn't work out that way. We were in a 400-year-old royal palace with creaky wooden floors and tapestries that would float dust down and frescoes on the ceiling. And every time a truck or a bus went by, right next to the palace in those days, they don't do that anymore, but in those days they did, the whole building would vibrate and the dust would fall. Not exactly the laboratory setting we were hoping for, but sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. There was no alternative but to do what we did. So I'm going to take you through all that, and then later in the day there's going to be a second lecture, and that's the one where I will address the radiocarbon dating, because most of you have already heard that in 1988 they carbon dated the shroud and said it was a medieval fake. So I want to address that in a specific lecture later on. This first lecture is simply going to be what we did in 1978 and what our conclusions were. So with that in mind, if I could ask Henry in the back to bring the lights down on the screens and on me. They don't need to see me anymore. What's up? Well, I'm the photographer. I want you to see my photographs. That's more important than seeing me. So if we can kind of kill the lights on me. Ah, isn't that better? Now you can see this. That's perfect. You see the screens pretty well? So let's start. Look at that. Everything's working. When the technology works, it's wonderful. When it doesn't, we've got a couple of geeks in the room beside myself, and they always make it work. Anyway, let's look at the shroud. 14.5 feet by 3.5 feet. Now, those are sort of strange measurements. And of course, what's really hard to judge is when you look at it, all you first see are all these marks down either side. And of course, what's really important is the image between those rows of burns and scorches. Now, in 1532, Shroud was damaged severely in a fire. And the poor Clare sisters in 1534 repaired it by sewing these triangular patches that you see into the cloth. And by the way, in 2002, those were removed, as was the backing sheet that was put onto the cloth by the sisters in 1534. And so when you first look at it, it's pretty hard to see. And that measurement is kind of odd. Now, in doing a little research, I looked up the cubit, which was a unit of measure used in the 1st century, and there were about 30 or 40 different measurements called the cubit. So that didn't help much. But there was one, I think it was the Syrian cubit, that if you were to take this size here, it would be 8 by 2, or 4 to 1, if you will. So that makes sense that perhaps this cloth might have been manufactured in Syria. But there's also some more recent DNA evidence on the cloth of the material itself that shows it might have been in India. So perhaps the cloth was made in India, brought to Syria, we don't know. We don't have the early history of the cloth itself, so it's sort of open to speculation. So, how does an image get on the cloth head to head the way we have on the shroud? And you clearly see on this Della Rovera painting the way the cloth would have wrapped his body. Now, I have some friends, including some Christian friends, who say, well, shroud has to be a fake because it says in the Gospels there were linen strips. Yeah, there were linen strips, because if you bind your body into a sheet like this, if you go to move the body, what's going to happen? It's just going to fall off. So they used linen strips to bind the body into the shroud. So that makes sense. By the 1st century, just in case anybody's wondering, even the Egyptians had stopped wrapping mummies that way. But that's one of the excuses some of my Christian friends tell me why the shroud has to be fake. They also tell me that, well, it's just a Catholic relic. You heard that one before? I always point out to them that that may be the case. Now, when did the shroud come under the control of the Catholic Church? Anybody want to guess?
1986.
There you go. There's somebody who's done some homework. Most people say 11th century, 1st century. Yeah, actually it was King Umberto, the owner of the shroud, the Savoy family, monarchy of Italy, died in 1983. It took several years for the will to go through probate. And in the end, he had left the shroud not to the institution of the church, but to the living Pope, the Holy See. And so in 1986, the Pope became the legal owner of the shroud. So when my Christian non-Catholic friends tell me it's a Catholic relic, I say, yeah, since 1986. But before that, it was in private hands for over 500 years. But you know, people look for all kinds of excuses to deny this. And remember my background. I didn't have any emotional attachment to the subject matter. I mean, I loved Jesus because he was one of our guys. That's all. But I was raised in a half Italian, half Jewish neighborhood. And, you know, the difference between a Jewish mother and an Italian mother, one says eat, eat, and the other says mancha, mancha. That's it. Otherwise, they're both the same. Anyway, this is how the cloth would have wrapped. And I'm going to kind of go through this because I talk a lot. So until 1898, not many people even heard about the shroud outside of northern Italy. But then this gentleman, Secondo Pia, who was a lawyer, had that big camera that you can see next to him. And he took that and he had to climb up a scaffolding with it in 1898 in the Royal Palace of Turin when the shroud was being publicly displayed. And he put this big scaffolding up and he had to photograph it through glass. And there was electricity in the Royal Palace, but it fluctuated, the voltage kept fluctuating. His first set of exposures didn't work out, he had to do it a second time. Not like today where you just hold up your phone and take a picture, you know. Things have changed a little. And you'll see the size of this camera, it's a little hard to tell, there's no scale in this. You'll see a later photo and you'll see what it looks like. Anyway, Secondo Pia makes the first photograph. And this is what his eyes saw when he looked through his camera. Now there's a big ground glass, lens at the front, a ground glass at the back. And you focus onto the ground glass, then you slide your glass plate into it, and you expose the film. So this is what his eyes saw, but he didn't have color film. Kodak hadn't come out with color film at that moment in time. So this is what his camera saw. And when he saw that, and I know it's kind of hard to see, let's make it easier. Instead of craning your necks to look at it that way, let's take half the shroud at a time. Let's have the man stand before us and look at what we have there. Now, if you look on the left, this is what you see when you look at the shroud. It's kind of odd looking, and that's because the lights and darks of the image are inverted. They're reversed. And you can clearly see that here. So when Secundo Pia looked at his glass plate, the negative, where the lights and darks have been reversed back, he immediately realized that what's on the shroud acts like a photographic negative. Now, I want to be clear about something. That's the only property of the shroud that's like a photographic negative. The shroud was not made photographically. Okay, I want to be clear on that because we proved that with our science. That was one of the theories that someone had proposed that, oh, well, the shroud's just a photograph made somewhere in medieval times. Some people said by Leonardo da Vinci, which I always laugh at because the shroud is on public display, documented 100 years before Da Vinci was born. He was a good artist, but he wasn't that good, so I don't see how he could have done that. But that's what some people want us to believe it's not true. Anyway, let's take a quick look at what we see here. So first of all, you can see blood stains on the top of the head from a cap or crown of thorns. You can see the face, and you can clearly see it on this one. You can see both cheekbones are swollen, one even more so than the other. It looks like somebody beat him severely, which they did the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane. And you can move down. You can see, by the way, that thing under the chin that some people say is a line or something. It's not part of the image. It's a crease in the cloth. And you can see that over here. But if you're only looking at the black and white photographs, you have no idea how many people have mistaken things on the cloth for parts of the image which they're not. That's why I always tell people that are doing research, start with the natural color image to see what the basis is before you go to the contrast enhanced black and white. Anyway, continuing down here, get down here quickly, we have a blood stain from a spear wound and a blood flow from it, again, next to some fire damage and a patch. So it's a little difficult to see, but there's the spear wound and a blood flow from that. You've come a little further down, you can see blood flow at the hands and a blood stain at the back of the wrist. Now, you know, most artists throughout the centuries have depicted Jesus with a nail right through the center of his palm. But forensic pathologists have shown us that that's really not technically correct. And the Romans knew how to do it. So I always give this demonstration. If you take your thumb and your little finger and put them together and look at your palm. Now there's a groove running up the middle. It's called the thenar furrow for technical people. It's right between the two fleshy parts of your palm. So if you take those together, and if you're a Roman soldier and you have to do 10 crucifixions today, you know exactly where to put the nail, because this is not a very nice job. You know it was the lowest ranking guy probably who was driving those nails in. But if you do that, put the nail right below, or right into that groove. If you take a look, it's only about an inch down from the center of the palm, but the exit wound, which is what we see on the shroud, is precisely where it's shown on the shroud. So the shroud is actually far more forensically accurate than any of the artistic interpretations of the crucifixion, except those done in maybe the more recent era where the shroud influenced the artists. Continuing on, we have more of the patches, those triangular patches. As I said, they were removed in 2002. And blood stains at the feet also from crucifixion nails. Now, it's not easy to tell from the shroud exactly how many nails were used. The one remains of a crucifixion victim that had been found where the nail was still in his ankle. Jehohanan found in, I think, 1963. And he had been crucified, and when they nailed him to the cross, they used one nail through each foot, through the side of the ankle, into the vertical part of the cross. And of course, my Catholic friends would like it to be 3 nails, because that goes with the Trinity. But the one thing that we see, and by the way, Jehohanan, the nail hit, they must have hit a knot when they were nailing him to the cross, because the tip of the nail bent and they couldn't extract it, so they buried him with the nail still intact. And that tells us that they used 4 nails to crucify. I'm not sure that it's critical to decide whether it's 3 or 4, but from the shroud it's quite difficult to say to a certainty how many nails were actually used. 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. Look what they did to him, you know. Anyway, looking at the back, you can see bloodstains at the head, and you can see they pretty much cover the scalp. Now, we've all seen the artistic little circlet, you know, that's beautiful. I think that comes from the motif used by artists back then when they depicted their Roman senators or people from, you know, of high stature. They put a laurel wreath around their head, the artist did. And I think that that motif was just followed, and they just changed the laurel to thorns and continued to use that motif. But in actuality, if you look at the shroud, you can see his entire scalp is covered with wounds, implying that probably just a big batch of nasty thorns were smashed onto his head. Remember, they weren't doing that to make him look good, they were doing that to humiliate him. So they weren't trying to make him look nice. Continuing on, you can see the bloodstains and the scourge marks that literally cover his back. Now, artists historically have shown Jesus being scourged at the back. But in reality, if you're standing behind somebody and whipping them, if you take just a baby step closer, what's going to happen? Those thongs are going to come around, they're going to hit the front of the body as well. And if you look at the front of the shroud, I didn't show this to you, I'm not going to back up. There's scourge wounds on the front of his body as well as the back, far more accurate than any artist's depiction of that scourging that's ever been done. So you can definitely see it. Now there's some burn holes on the shroud, you can see them clearly over here. These L-shaped, inverted L-shaped burn holes. Keep those in mind for the afternoon lecture when I talk about the radiocarbon dating. So those L-shaped burn holes, which by the way, predate the 1532 fire, some earlier event that wasn't documented, but those L-shaped burn holes are significant, and you'll find out in the afternoon lecture exactly why when we talk about carbon dating. Continuing on, if you look closely, again, you'll see scourge wounds all the way down to his ankles. You can see him covering his back, his legs, his buttocks, all the way down to his feet. They literally scourged him from head to toe, literally. And you can also see a bloody footprint. If you look here, now what does that tell us? Well, if you're laying on your back, and don't anybody try it now, but if you're laying on your back and you want to put your foot flat, you have to bend your knee. You cannot bend your ankle far enough to get your foot flat. So it's apparent from the shroud that one knee is bent. Some researchers believe that he was in rigor mortis after he passed, and that was indicative of his pose when he was on the cross itself. So one foot might have been raised. And that certainly would have been the case when he was in the tomb. On the other side, we only see the back of the ankle. In other words, if you look here, the toes are really pointing away from you. You're looking at the back of the ankle. So that's what we see on the cloth. Now, I'm going through this pretty quickly because there's so much more I want to show you and talk to you about. But you can get a general idea of how this all works. And this is what's on the cloth that has caused now a study of the cloth for over a century. And do we have all the answers yet? No. Remember, science has only been given one opportunity to examine the cloth in depth, and that's now 41 years ago, 1978. Would be nice for another opportunity using 21st century technology. The data that our team collected back in 1978 still forms the basic foundation of all shroud research to this day. We didn't answer all the questions. We went there to answer one question: how is the image formed? And when we came back, we couldn't give you an answer. Well, we could tell you what it's not, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So let's continue on now. Let's now talk about, let's see, there we go. Close-up of the scourge wounds, you can see them. And this is just the ones on the back. I've already shown you that cover his body front and back. And that's what a flagrum looks like. And they have actually found some of these lead weights in Herculaneum when they dug out Herculaneum near Pompeii. They actually found some of these weights. Dr. Robert Buckland, who was on our team, and some of you in here might remember the TV show Quincy. Dr. Robert Buckland was the basis for that show and the consultant to the program producers, and he was the forensic pathologist on our team. So we had some pretty heavyweight people there, and Dr. Buckland took one of these lead weights found in Herculaneum, laid them onto a life-size image of the shroud, and they're the same shape, form, and size. So there's a pretty good indication that's what was used on the man of the shroud. Now, I told you that we had this VP8 image analyzer, and that's what it looks like. Now, I can say this in this room. It looks like an old TV, or an old receiver or tuner. Now, say that to a 10-year-old and get a blank stare. What's a tuner? Well, that's how we used to listen to the radio in the old days. Now we do it on everything on our phones. So this, by the way, I had a 10-year-old kid ask me if film was a USB device. Think about that for a minute. It makes me feel older than I already am. Anyway, this is the device, and you can see it's just a bunch of knobs and dials and displays, and below it is a green screen monitor from which the output goes. You input an image with a black and white camera, video camera, and the results are displayed on a green screen. That is actual footage off the screen of a real VP8. I didn't do this in the computer. This is what it looked like. And if you look at the bottom one especially, the significance of the VP8 is that it demonstrated that there was a correlation between the cloth and the body distance to form the image, because it yields the natural relief of a human form. A normal photograph doesn't do that, and I'm going to prove that to you in a minute. But you can clearly see down here the natural relief of a form. Now, that 8 in VP8 stands for 8-bit, which means there's only 8 levels of gray between black and white. So it's a very limited grayscale, which means it's going to be a rather coarse and not a fine and refined image that we're used to seeing. But it was enough to be the catalyst for our team to put this team together and go and examine the shroud. Now, I said I'm going to show you that normal photos don't do this. Take a look. These are 2 cute little kids. These are the grandchildren of my friend who owned a VP8 in 1997 when I went and made these videos. And I just took a picture of his grandkids off the wall, knowing that I was going to tell everybody a normal photo doesn't do this. So let's take a look. First of all, notice the little boy here, notice his hair is going down into his head. Notice that his nose and cheeks are flat, that his eyes are distorted, his mouth is, looks like a monster out of a horror movie, basically. And the little kid on the right has no contours at all, it's just flat. Normal photographs don't yield the same natural relief that we see on the shroud. Now, if this information is truly there, we should be able to detect it more than one way. So this is an old darkroom technique. Imagine explaining that to a 10-year-old. Anyway, it's an old darkroom technique that my dear friend Aldo Gareschi, a professional photographer in Turin, applied to the shroud. I won't go into the technical details, but it's called the photo relief technique or edge enhancement. And take a look, you can see, and remember, it's not limited to an 8-level grayscale. In other words, there's a wider range of colors or grayscale available, so you get a more refined image, and you can clearly see that here. Look at the face. Natural relief of the face, the hands, you can see the fingers, knees all the way down, the back of the head. Notice he's got kind of a long thing of hair, kind of like this. That's not why I have it this way, I just don't like to get my hair cut. Anyway, you can see all the way down his calves, his feet, his ankles. So you can see that that information is there embedded into the cloth, but of course we do live in the digital age. So this is the face done by a gentleman in Malta. He wrote to me many years ago. I sent him a file, and this is what he sent me back, something he did. Now, of course, by today's standards, even this is old, but what's the copyright date on that? I guess I don't have it up there. Probably about 1997 or 98 this was done. With the technology and the computer technology that we have today, this could be done even more dramatically, I'm sure. But this shows you 3 different mechanisms that allow us to extract and visualize the 3D or topographic information that's encoded in the Shroud's image. So, our team starts in small groups around the US. There was a group in California that included the Jet Propulsion Lab, Brooks Institute of Photography, and myself. There was a group in New Mexico, the guys from Los Alamos and Sandia Laboratories. There was a group in Colorado from the Air Force Academy. And there was a group in New England from the New England Institute that had some of our medical people on our team. At any rate, we spent 17 months developing experiments, designing the equipment. What do you do with a 14.5-foot long sheet of cloth when you want to examine it and you want to cause it no harm? You can't just thumbtack it to a piece of wood. Well, ostensibly, you're not supposed to anyway. We knew that if we did that, they would beat us up. So what we did was we designed a steel table so we could fasten the cloth to it with magnets. And we had to ship that monstrous table over to Turin, along with about 80 other crates of equipment. And so, because we hadn't met as a team yet, a month before we were to leave to go to Turin, we met together as a team for the first time. Each group all came together in Amston, Connecticut for what we called the dry run. You can now see that steel table. That's not the Shroud, that's just a replica we were using at the time as a test. But you can see this great big long steel table, and this is what we shipped off to Turin. As a matter of fact, there were about 80 crates of equipment that got shipped to Turin. So we had the dry run, and by the way, here's a comment that might shock you. There was no Pope when we examined the Shroud. No Pope. Because the night before we left for Turin, September 28th, 29th, I guess it was, 1978, John Paul I died unexpectedly. Elected until October 16th, I believe it was. Yes. And we examined the Shroud from the 8th to the 13th. There was no Pope when we examined the Shroud. We were in Turin watching TV when the white smoke went up and John Paul II was elected. But I don't mention that to my non-Catholic audiences. They're not that interested. Anyway, here we are. Well, I figured you guys would be interested. Here we have the Royal Palace. I'm sorry, this is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, the Guarini Chapel Dome, and this square building with the courtyard in the center. That's the Royal Palace where we examined the Shroud. Now, the cathedral, the Guarini Chapel, and the palace are all connected. So you can walk into the cathedral, go around behind the main altar, walk into the Guarini Chapel where the Shroud had been stored for hundreds of years, and then out the back of the Guarini Chapel right into the Royal Palace, and you'll see some of that in a moment. So where we are now, the Shroud was on public display in 1978 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of it being in Turin from 1578 forward. So people, there was public display and people came. It doesn't look like there are that many people there, does it? Until you look a little closer. Let's look down the road here where people are queued up. How'd you like to wait in that queue for 10 hours? Just to get a 3-minute look at the Shroud before you're ushered out of the cathedral. The good news is you don't have to do this anymore. There was a new invention called the internet. You've heard of it. And the internet allows them now, when there's a public display, you go online, you make a reservation. You pick the date and the time that you want to be there, those that are available. And they tell you, don't come early, just show up on time. So instead of a 10-hour queue, I think the last time in 2015, it took about 15 or 20 minutes. And there was not a huge long queue like this. And so it's much more efficient now when you go to Turin. And tentatively, the next scheduled public exhibition of the Shroud is 2025, which is also the next holy year of the Catholic Church. How many Jews know that, do you think? Until I've been hanging around with my friend Father Dalton over here. And by the way, I'm so thrilled to have Father Dalton here. Do you know he was 7 or 8 years ago, he was actually one of my students. I teach a course at the Pontifical University in Rome. And about the second day, I knew that this guy was way ahead of the curve. Well, now he travels the world lecturing on the Shroud too. So I'm thrilled that we're going to be on the same podium together today. That's going to be fun. Anyway, so there you are. We have this big long queue. We have all these people. This inside the cathedral, there's the shroud. People would come down one side, stand down here at the bottom. I think you might be able to see it. Some people standing there, they give you about 2 or 3 minutes, and then they move you out the other side, and the next group comes in. Now they have tiers so that a bigger group of people can stay in front of the shroud, and you're about, I guess, about 3 or 4 meters away from it, so you get reasonably close. But it's also behind very thick bulletproof glass, so everybody with their little cameras or their phones, you know, that infrared focusing autofocus you have, trouble is it reflects off the surface of the thick glass and the shroud stays out of focus. Anybody been there to see the shroud in 2015? So if you took pictures, you'll notice the pictures weren't quite in focus because that infrared autofocus gets fooled by the thick glass. So now you know why. Anyway, this is the Guarini Chapel. And behind this grill work in this beautiful black marble altar was where the shroud reliquary box was kept. I say was, all this is in the past, because 1997, they had just restored the dome of the Guarini Chapel. Pieces had been falling down, so they moved the shroud into the cathedral, restored the whole dome, the scaffolding was still in place, and in 97, suddenly there's a fire that completely destroys the Guarini Chapel. Just reopened last year after, what, 21 years. Just restored it again last year. They did not restore the black marble altar. It was completely destroyed by the high temperature. But, and it was an arson fire, and they never caught the arsonists. What did I say? Anyway, that's where it was kept. That was the old wooden box. And I think that at some point in time, Turin realized maybe a wooden box isn't the best thing to keep the shroud in. Because they would roll it up on a dowel, put it into this wooden box. You'll notice there's a kind of silver inlay on the outside. I think I have a better photo of it. Now the box, the reliquary box, sits in the Shroud Museum in Turin, so you can go see it. That's what it actually looks like. But they decided after all that, maybe we should get a different thing to put it in, and now it's kept flat in a special reliquarium, or reliquary. It's in under bulletproof glass. It's kept flat, light tight, nitrogen argon atmosphere, much like if you go to the U.S., the Constitution, and at the Smithsonian, you'll see all those. Preserved, temperature and humidity controlled by computer. So the shroud is better preserved today than it ever has been in the past. And if you go to Turin today, there's the big, long reliquary box. This is what you'll see. This is in a niche in the front left of the cathedral. This is what you'll see. You will not see the shroud itself. But the nice thing is they can roll this out in front of the main altar in the cathedral when they want to display it. And it comes out and hydraulically and is displayed, still behind glass, still being preserved, protected. So it's better preserved, as I said, than it's ever been before. So let's see, where do we go from here? Oh yes, that's me. Next, yeah, I know it used to be black, wasn't it? There used to be a lot more of it. Well, there's still a lot of it just sliding off the back of my head now. But anyway, that's me. Next is Secundo Pia's camera. And around my neck is a Nikon F3, which in its day was a beautiful, wonderful piece of equipment. Today they're both equally obsolete because they both use film. Film is obsolete. Anyway, continuing on, this is in the museum, and of course the museum has been expanded, and it's a beautiful place to go. So if you get to Turin, when the shroud is not on public display, you saw what it looks like in the cathedral. You can see the reliquary box itself, but you can go to the museum and see all kinds of things that are part of the history of the shroud, including photographs of the cloth. So, one thing I didn't tell you, we got to Turin, we got off the airplane. Remember I said we shipped 80 crates of equipment? We got to Turin, we get off the airplane, the first thing they tell us is, Italian Customs has seized all of your equipment and they're not going to release it. Why did they seize all of our equipment? Well, we had an X-ray machine with us. And on the outside of the crate with the X-ray machine was a radiation sticker, which you're required to have. And apparently that put the fear of God into the Italian Customs folks, so they seized and wouldn't release all of our equipment. Now, there was remember I mentioned the Holy Shroud Guild, the priests in the U.S. that had been promoting the shroud. One of them was a man named Father Peter Rinaldi. He was from Turin. He was an altar boy at the Turin Cathedral in 1931 when the shroud was on public display. So Father Peter, being Turinese from Turin, he said, I will get the equipment out on the 5th day. We were there a week in advance to get everything unpacked and ready, and for 5 days the Italian customs officials wouldn't release it. Now, the other piece of information that I've just found out more recently was that Archbishop Balestrero, the Archbishop of Turin, had put up the thing for the, what's the word I'm looking for, the property, deed of ownership of the cathedral to use as a kind of a check and balance so that they would release the equipment. But most importantly, Father Peter went down to the customs office because he knew how to do things in Turin. He went down and said, who's in charge? So the man in charge comes out and he goes, I'm in charge, brother, what would you like? He says, what is your name, sir? Well, now the guy's a little intimidated because Father Peter was about 6'3", he's a big guy. And so he's intimidated. He says, well, why do you need my name? And Father Peter said, there's about to be an international incident and I'd like to give you credit for it. Then he slipped him 100,000 lira and the equipment was immediately released. 100,000 lira. Back in those days, about $80. Not a lot of money. Anyway, so while the equipment's tied up, of course I had my Nikons with me, so I'm in a royal, I'm from Pittsburgh, PA, not many royal palaces around there. So here I am in the royal palace making photographs, and you can see those parquet wooden floors, and everything gilt and gold, and this hallway was basically where we stored some of our equipment. It was not anything more than that. That's one of the frescoes in what we call the equipment maintenance room. Looked up, that's what you saw. And this is the fresco in the room in which we examined the shroud. And I gotta tell you, standing under this, looking up at it, was like looking at a sculpted, relief. But it's just a fresco painted into the wet plaster when they did the artwork. But that's what we saw when we looked up in the room with the shroud. So, Father Peter gives the guy the bride. The equipment gets released, they put her on a dump truck, and this is in the courtyard of the Royal Palace. And I was making this photo and thinking, you know what, any second the guy's just gonna pull the lever, and when he pulls the lever, he's just gonna dump our equipment out. So somebody actually ran up to the driver and said, please don't dump out the equipment. And the driver said, of course not, unload the truck for me, please. So we had to unload the truck and move all the equipment into the Royal Palace ourselves, remembering we'd already lost 5 full days of the 7-day preparation period. So we're down to about a day and a half left. So it was already pressure. Of course, those 5 days sitting around, when you're dealing with a bunch of scientists. Any scientists in the room? I'm trying not to offend anybody. Okay, I didn't see any hands go up. You're sitting around with a bunch of scientists. They have meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. And for some of us, it was driving us crazy. People were starting to get on each other's nerves. We were there to work, not to sit around and talk. And so it got very frustrating, but finally the equipment got delivered on the dump truck, and we had to then load it back into the Royal Palace. And here we are, just moving it in. Now, there's our table set up, steel table, and that's me peeking my head around the edge there, just in case you wondered. And you can see that was one of those meetings again. Sitting around waiting for the shroud to be brought to us. The shroud was on public display at the time, and it had been on display, that was the first time since 1931 that it had been publicly displayed, so I think it was 2.5 million people came to see it in the 5 weeks that it was on public display in '78. And I used to look at this and say, oh, look at that modern technology in front of that old tapestry. Well, I have no idea what those boxes are that Rudy's working on, but whatever it is, I'm sure you have an app for that in your phone by now. I have no idea what the technology, some of the instruments that were brought were beyond my scope. But there we are unpacking, that's Vern Miller and Ernie Brooks unpacking some of the photographic equipment. This is the equipment maintenance room. I want to point something out to you. That was the parquet wooden floors. Notice the garden hoses. One of our instruments needed to be water cooled. This is before solid state electronics. So we needed to get some water. Well, I'm standing in the doorway looking into the equipment maintenance room. By the way, the doorway back here to the right, that's into the room where we examine the shroud. So I'm standing in a hallway making this photo, and to my left is a long hallway, and at the very end of that hallway is the only operating bathroom in that half of the Royal Palace. So we had to run out and buy a whole bunch of garden hoses and string them all together, run them down the hallway and run them through the equipment maintenance room into the room where we examine the shroud, and you can see them right down here. So, you know, we were dealing with the limits of 1978 technology, which is why so many of us would like to see another opportunity to apply 21st century technology. And we had to cover the windows. We were doing infrared or thermal imaging. The thermal imaging instruments in 1978 were not nearly as good or sophisticated as they are today. There was some success with that experiment, but some experiments were more successful than others. That one was one of the lesser successful ones. Now, the man on the right, that's the guy I did the atomic bomb thing with, Don DeVan. I'm one of the other Jewish guys. That's not me, that's an optical physicist, Sam Pellicore, and Vern Miller, the chief scientific photographer, had been one of my professors at Brooks Institute of Photography, and I got him on board. Because one photographer could not do all the requirements that this particular project required. Anyway, continuing on, they're setting up a camera rail system. Remember, you have a long sheet of cloth, and so the problem is, if you want to photograph it, you want to keep the distance between the camera and the subject matter the same, so that later on you can put it together into a single image. So I photographed it in two halves. Now, because of what they're doing, they're measuring the distance and sandbagging the rail system in place. I could photograph half the shroud, slide the camera to the other half, do the second exposure, and 20 years later, when I had them digitized and put them together in Photoshop, it was a perfect match, because these guys thought to do this that many years earlier. So, if you've ever been to Italy, you know things don't always run on time. I'm trying to be polite, because okay? Usually things run a little late. As my friends in Rome call it, Rome time. They said they'll pick me up at 8 and at 9:15 they arrive, Rome time. Anyway, so imagine our chagrin and surprise when an hour and a half ahead of schedule somebody yelled, "Here comes the shroud." So here I am running out in the hall. This is where the young people get a laugh. So I have to put the lens on the camera and the flash on the camera and turn on the flash to let it charge up. And I run out into the hallway and I make this one photograph. And if you look close, that doorway that they just brought the shroud through is the back door of the Guarini Chapel. So they brought it through the cathedral, through the chapel, into the Royal Palace, and down the hallway. And if you were to look really close at this photograph, you'll see that the only thing sharply in focus is the wall back there. And these guys are completely out of focus, but this event will never be repeated, so even a slightly out of focus photograph is better than none at all, I guess. But those are some of the limitations. The other thing is, when we unpacked our steel table, it was not stainless steel, because stainless steel is treated in a way that might have been harmful to the shroud. So it was not a stainless steel, it was just steel. So when we unpacked it, had a white powdery corrosion across the entire surface of it. Now, these guys were so smart, they anticipated that might happen. And we had two guys from NASA on our team, and they brought with them 2 rolls of gold foil mylar, the same stuff you've seen in the cargo bay of the space shuttle and on satellites, that gold stuff. That's gold impregnated mylar. And when I'm in America, I always say that's your tax dollars at work, but you're Canadians, you don't have to worry about that. But that's expensive stuff, and we had to cover the removable panels of the table using the gold foil mylar so that we wouldn't cause any harm to the shroud. So you can see already the shroud's in the room early, and notice in the back there we haven't even finished covering the panels of the table yet, and boom, there's the shroud unveiled. Now I've got to be honest with you, and I think I said this at the beginning, I was totally skeptical and thought we'd get there and we'd see the paint and come home. It's now 42 years later, and I'm still doing it because there was no paint. And you'll see more about that in a minute. But here we are, we're doing it. By the way, it took me about 10 or 15 minutes looking at the shroud once it was unveiled, and I knew it wasn't a painting. I knew that just with my eyes after 15 minutes, because we photographers always have a magnifying glass somewhere in our pocket, 10 power usually. And so the first thing I did was whip that out and start looking at the image areas on the cloth. Because if there was paint or pigment there, my eyes would have seen it immediately. Now, of course, our science ultimately proved that it wasn't there, but right away, within 10 or 15 minutes, I knew whatever it wasn't a painting. And again, as I say, our science finally proved that. Now, there's a hidden story in this photograph. Notice on the left are the Italian scientists, and on the right are the American scientists. The Italian scientists were not thrilled to have a bunch of guys from big-name American laboratories showing up on their territory, and I understand that. I can understand how they felt. But they told us, okay, they finally realized, yes, these guys are going to actually examine the shroud. So they said, fine, but if you touch the shroud, there were carabinieri, state policemen, in plain clothes, guarding us with guns. And they said, if you touch the shroud, they're going to shoot you. So notice that the Americans, look where their hands are. How do you examine the Shroud of Turin with your hands tied behind your back? Well, obviously you can't. So we're waiting, and then Professor Gio here, bald gentleman, you'll notice his hand is already approaching the cloth. He starts handling the cloth, and we're all waiting for the gunfire. And realized afterwards, well, no, that. Now, I don't know if they were being mean-spirited or if they thought that was being humorous, but we took them at their word for a few minutes. And this whole thing might have lasted 30 seconds before we realized, no, that's not true. But I happened to capture this moment in time, and for years I didn't want to tell the story, but now I tell the story of how this happened, why the Americans all have their hands behind their back. Yeah, it's kind of silly, but that's what happened. And now notice, there's the shroud that's been fastened for public display onto a white painted piece of wood. How do you think they fastened it to the piece of wood? Thumbtacks. Yes, they were worried about us causing harm, so we built a steel table and bring special magnets that are covered with Teflon so that no metal particles might get on the shroud, and they thumbtacked it to a piece of wood. So we're looking at each other and scratching our heads, and they were worried about us. Had we done that, well, I mean, the way I see it, they kind of crucified the shroud. There were about 100 thumbtacks. And every time they took one out, ladies, you know what you find? A little hole, rusty hole with a little rusty circle around it. So that was the case. Anyway, that's how, and you can see we still hadn't yet finished covering the table. Now they're getting ready to remove all the thumbtacks. And so they remove the thumbtacks, and then the table could rotate horizontally or vertically. So the table is now rotated flat. All the panels are finally covered with the gold foil mylar. And let's see what happens. And the shroud is then moved onto that table. I don't see a clock in here. How am I doing time-wise? 20 minutes? Is that what I got left? Okay. Because one thing, you know, I have to point out what my initials are. Think about it. Well, see, I have to be careful how I say things. There are not only ladies present, but there's priests around. I don't want to offend anybody. Anyway, so we move the shroud onto the table, and then we begin our actual scientific examination from the 8th to the 13th, when there was no Pope. And those, by the way, those white things around the periphery, those are the bar magnets coated in Teflon so that no particles will get on the cloth. Okay, so we finally start examining, and the first thing they say is, okay, this guy's going to go first. This is Swiss criminalist Max Frey, who obviously wanted to do some sticky tape samples off the shroud. We, too, were doing sticky tape samples from the shroud. We went to 3M, you've heard of them, and they manufactured a special tape on a special mylar base that would leave no sticky residue on the cloth when it was peeled off. And the mylar tape itself had specific optical properties to allow polarized light microscopy directly on the tapes. So that was what we brought. Max, on the other hand, obviously stopped off at the nearest dime store on his way to the palace, bought the cheapest roll of sticky tape, can't call it Scotch tape because it's not, and he's noticed he's wearing his white gloves, cotton gloves, and he's trying to put the sticky tape down, and he's putting it down, and he's peeling it up, and we're looking at this, and we're looking at each other and wondering why somebody hasn't shot him yet. Because, I mean, look what he's doing. Look at the pressure he's putting on this old piece of cloth. And we were pretty shocked about that. And every place Max stuck his tape left a little sticky residue that 20 years later needed to be cleaned off. Because, you know, some stickiness attracts dust, they roll it up, dust, boom. You got little marks on the shroud. So then Max walks over to the face, and he's just about to put that sticky tape down on the face, the most iconic part of the Shroud's image, and what happens? John Jackson, the co-founder of our team, runs over, physically grabs him and yanks him away from the cloth. If it looks like they're about to hit each other and the man in the middle, Professor Ganella, the scientific advisor to the Archbishop of Turin, if it looks like he's acting as a referee, that's exactly what's happening. They almost came to blows because John physically pulled him away from the cloth. And it was decided after much debate, in about 10 minutes, no one would put any tape on the face of the man of the shroud. Sadly, we found out in '88, carbon dating at some point, Professor Rigi, who was there when we were there in '78, did take some tape samples of the face. Not permitted, not authorized, but he did it anyway. So, continuing on. Now, there's Professor Ricci, great guy, smart guy. He was given 2 weeks' notice and told, hey, in 2 weeks, the Americans are coming, we need an Italian to go first, so think of something. So he came up with a couple of clever ideas, first of which was to separate the shroud from the backing sheet that had been sewn onto it by the poor Clare sisters and insert a camera and a vacuum between the two cloths, both to see the backside of the cloth and at the same time to vacuum any debris that might be trapped between the two. And at that moment, now let me back up just for a second. This is when they're separating the two cloths, from the cloth from the backing sheet. And at that moment in time, I realized we're going to get to see the backside of the shroud for the first time in over 400 years. So I ran around to the other side in time to make this photo, which is probably one of the best well-known photos I made in '78. And this one's perfectly in focus, I might add, unlike that earlier one. Anyway, continuing on, I felt so bad for the sister. I could tell that this was very stressful for her. She was charged with caring for the shroud, and here are all these guys poking and prodding it. And I looked over to her, and I could sense her distress, and I made this photograph, and I show it. My heart goes out. I'm sure she's passed by now, but my heart went out to her. I actually felt for her at that moment. Those are her hands, and you can see that she's now removing some small samples, not for us, but for the Italian researchers. And now Rigi and his assistant are about to separate the shroud from its backing sheet with a little brass thing that they invented, designed. And there's the vacuum. It's not the kind we use at the house. It's not typical Hoover. This is a laboratory vacuum. And in the handle was a place for filters, sterile filters, so that he could vacuum an area, collect whatever debris there might have been in that area, make a note of it, set that filter aside, put a new one in, and did that in a number of different areas. Now, he also had an endoscopic camera system. 1978, endoscopic cameras needed a big fiber optic bundle. Fiber optics in 1978 were very crude and coarse, so the image created by his endoscopic camera looks like, you've seen the photos of what it looks like to photograph through the eye of a fly or something like that, a bunch of little circles with spaces between them. That's the way fiber optics were in 1978, so the results weren't great. However, when he turned on his focusing light, and we saw light passing through the cloth, notice that's the forehead blood stain. When light passes through, we saw that the blood soaked into the cloth. As a matter of fact, all the way to the backside. So it actually soaked all the way through the cloth. Now, remember, one of the big theories was this was a painting. Well, if it were a painting and we transmitted light through the entire cloth, we'd see wherever the paint was, just like we do with the blood, right? So they said, Barrie, they found a spot where they gave me 15 minutes to photograph the entire shroud with transmitted light. Now, let's look at that for a moment. Look. Spear wound bloodstains at the hands, arms, and wrist, water stains from the 1532 fire, scorches, burns, patches, holes. What don't you see? Don't see the image, because it's not painted. And this is the first piece of scientific evidence we had indicating that there was nothing applied to the shroud to create the image, because it would have shown up with transmitted light. And just to give you a frame of reference, okay, let me back it up, and see if it'll back up. There you go. So what you can see is, where the image is, there's nothing been applied to the cloth, no paints or pigments. And this is the first real hard evidence we have of that. Now, this is the part where I could easily put you to sleep, and I only have 10 minutes left. I'd rather not. So rather than say all these big words and put you completely out, I'm going to show you the instrumentation, and I've put the names of the experiments up on the screen just so you'll know what experiments were being done. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. And you can see now, by today's standards, these instruments are museum pieces. But in 1978, they were state-of-the-art, circa 1978. And this is why many of us would like to see another round of testing, similar to what we did in multidisciplinary group, again with, different testing using the most up-to-date 21st century technology. Remember, we only got one shot at it. We tried to have a second go-around in 1984, but it was turned down. So many of the questions raised by the data we collected in 1978 have never been able to be answered because, we went to ask one or two specific questions, but we came back with a vast amount of data, and we couldn't, with all that extra data, came a lot of new questions that we've not yet been able to answer, kind of sadly. X-radiography, X-rays. Well, so if you take a bunch of X-rays of the shroud and then you come back on an airplane, what do you do when you get to the X-ray machines in the airport? You can't do it. They'll be destroyed. So we had to process the X-rays on site. Well, this is actually one of the X-rays. So what do you need to process X-rays? You need two things. You need a room that can be made totally dark, and you need a water supply. Remember what I said about a water supply? Sometimes you just have to make do with what you have. We had to turn the only operating bathroom into a dark room, which means that they would come into the room with the Shroud of Turin and say, just like we did with the kids before we took them on a ride in the car, anybody need to go to the bathroom? You better go now, because for the next hour it's going to be a dark room, you won't be able to go in there. But we managed to do, I think they did 32 X-rays. And that's the other problem. Remember the parquet wooden floors? Remember the fact that traffic was probably right next to the palace? They could only do the X-rays in the middle of the night. Because when the dentist puts that thing in your tooth and he says, okay, hold it, click, click, takes about a second. Well, this is a low power X-ray, 20 minutes per exposure. So we all had to leave the room, and the poor guy, once he started exposing the X-ray, couldn't move his feet for 20 minutes. And he managed to get 32 done over 5 days and nights, over 5 nights mainly. So we were not working in the best of circumstances, but we did manage to get a lot done. Photomicroscopy, photographs through a microscope. I show you this one with great reverence. This is the blood of the man of the shroud. And I know the significance that has for you, so I say that with reverence. And notice it's still red. And that's what kept me from accepting the shroud's authenticity for 17 years. Nobody explained it until 17 years later. Now, our blood chemist on our team was Dr. Alan Adler, another Jewish guy, as a matter of fact. And 17 years after we were done, I was almost convinced the shroud was authentic. But nobody had explained why the blood was still red. Old blood's supposed to turn brown or black pretty quickly. Why was the blood still red? So I was on the phone with Dr. Alan Adler. Al was quite a unique man. And I said to him, he said to me, he says, you know, Barrie, he says, I'm starting to believe this thing's got to be the real thing. I said, you know, I feel the same. Boy, did he get mad at me at that moment in time. Didn't you read my paper? I said, yeah, Al, that was 17 years ago. You're a chemist and I'm a hippie photographer, so excuse me if I didn't completely understand it. He said, well, didn't you see that I found a high content of bilirubin? Bilirubin's not a Jewish guy from New York. It's a compound made in the liver, pumped into the bloodstream, especially when somebody's being tortured and under great duress. And bilirubin is a hemolytic agent, breaks down the cell walls of the red blood cells, releasing hemoglobin, stays red forever. That's the last piece of the puzzle for me, and that's when I was fully convinced the Shroud was authentic, and that was 1995. Shortly thereafter, a friend of mine called me and said, hey, you know that Shroud thing you're involved with? Well, turns out that's just a photo made by Leonardo da Vinci. And I laughed. That's the first time I'd heard that in 1995, because a couple of Brits published a book called something about Leonardo da Vinci making the Shroud. Anyway, Da Vinci Shroud, I think it was called. Well, all I could say is Leonardo da Vinci did it. This has got to be the most ridiculous thing, and yet people all over the world bought the book and buy into this nonsense. So Adler, so my friend calls me and he tells me this, and I asked him, where did you get your information? He said, well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store. Now, I don't know how it is here in Canada, but in America, at the grocery store checkout center is where all the tabloids are. So obviously he was getting his information from a tabloid, and that just struck me as just a terrible thing, that people to whom this object is so important don't have access to the information. While I was on the phone with my friend, I wrote 4 words on the manila folder on my desk: consider building a website. And that, I believe, is the moment God reached down and smacked me upside the head and said, now here's the real job. And now our website's 23 plus years old. We've been seen by over 15 million or more people. And we are literally the largest and the oldest resource of information on the Shroud on the internet. Anyway, I'm going to go through a couple more of these because I'm almost out of time. So I'm going to kind of skip through some of these technical things, but I want you to notice something. This is an ultraviolet fluorescence photograph. This is the spear wound. You can actually see the shape of the wound and the blood flowing from it. You notice there's a white area surrounding that. Can you see that? It's subtle. It's like a halo around the blood stain. Well, that's the serum that spreads out from the particulates of the blood, only visible with ultraviolet fluorescence photography, not visible to the naked eye. So you think somebody will forger did this and put that there and hope that somebody would invent a technology to see it 700 years later? If you believe that, I got a bridge I can sell you in Brooklyn. Anyway, continue. Yeah, there you go. There I go. Now, I've already shown you the transmitted light. I was also responsible for documenting where all the other researchers took their data. So I gave them little magnets coated with Teflon. And they would place a magnet at a spot where they'd just taken some data. And then I would, when they finished an area, I would come in, make a photo like this, and came back from Turin and spent several months creating 8 maps of each of the different experiments. You can find them on shroud.com. I could do it today in 2 days in Photoshop. It took me months to do it in the darkroom the old way. So things have changed. Now, I told you about our sticky tape. Ray Rogers, a chemist on our team, designed a torque applicator to apply a known pressure. Not his thumb, the way Max did. But you'll notice there's a pointer and a scale, a little hard to see the scale there. So when he applied the tape to the shroud, he could apply it with a uniform known amount of pressure. Max just used his thumb. And when he removed the tapes, he realized if you stuck them down onto glass, whatever was in the sticky side of the tape would get pushed deeper into the gum of the tape. So he designed and had fabricated well slides. If you look closely, you can see that the tapes are only touching on the edges, and there's a millimeter or two of space so that the gum side of the tape wasn't pushed in with whatever residue was on it. And we had a computer. Sort of. He had to build it. It was a kit. It's called an Inside 8080. You know the little clocks that you buy that you stick on your fridge, and when the battery dies, you throw it away and put up an oven? That's the chip that was in this computer. Not a very sophisticated one, and all it ever did for 5 days and nights was that. I have no idea what that was. That's all it ever could do. I felt really bad for him. After 5 days and nights, he accomplished nothing with it. But what's really cool is the thing that it's sitting on. It's Digital Systems floppy disk drive, 8-inch. How much do you think each of those disks could hold? How about 186 kilobytes? Which means you'd need, what, 600 of them for one iPad photo or something like that. So I felt very badly for him. The computers really didn't work. The only computers that did work were the ones at the Jet Propulsion Lab and at Los Alamos. They had Cray computers. Any computer people in the room know what that is. High-end, water-cooled computers. But the stuff we took to Turin didn't do much. So, remembering that our team went there, I'm sorry I'm making you read something. I'm trying to keep it easy for you. So, here you have it. The conclusions. We went there to answer a simple question. How's the image formed? We came back unable to answer that simple question. We can tell you what it's not. Not a painting, not a photograph, not a scorch. But we know of no mechanism that can make an image with these chemical and physical properties, and no one's ever duplicated it to this day. I've looked at everything, every attempt in the last 40 years, nobody's even come close. I'm going to skip through that. So, I told you at the very beginning that I would explain to you what a nice Jewish boy like me is doing involved the most important relic of Christianity. But before I tell you that, I have to tell you what my little Jewish mother said after hearing a Shroud lecture. Okay, so I'm from Pittsburgh, PA, and went back there for my 40th high school reunion about 15 years ago. My mom was there. So my Catholic friends in Pittsburgh said, why don't you give a Shroud talk while you're here for the reunion? So they went to the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh. They gave us a beautiful venue. They put me in the bulletin. They put me on the radio with Father Langwood, who'd been on the radio for like 40 years, Catholic priest. We had a beautiful event. My mother was there, my brother, my cousins. You know how family is. You know, they all come. And we're driving home at the end. And my mother is absolutely silent. And I have to tell you that when a Jewish mother is silent, be afraid. It's pretty scary. Not known for being silent. So finally I turned to her and I said, okay, Mother, what do you think? And she looked at me and she said, well, of course, it's authentic. Now this is a little lady born in Poland, immigrant to the United States as a child, high school education, not a sophisticated woman at all. And she hears one lecture and she said, well, of course, it's authentic. And I'm shocked. I mean, it took me 17 years and I left my DNA on the cloth itself. And yet she hears one lecture and she's convinced. So I said, okay, what makes you say that? And that's when, you know how a mother can get a certain tone of voice, sort of exasperated with their child. She got that tone of voice with me. And she said, Barrie, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years. If it belonged to anyone else, it wouldn't have mattered. And I thought about that, and I kind of laughed and thought, oh, that's cute. And then I thought about it. That's such a profound observation. Think about this. There's blood on that cloth and an image on that cloth, both violations of Jewish law. It's supposed to be buried with the body, and images are forbidden by Jews and Muslims to this day. So whoever saved and rescued this piece of cloth put themselves at great risk. And my mother just simply sees through all the other stuff, and she cuts right to it. She says, they wouldn't have kept it all that time unless it was real. Blew me away. So, it took me a long time, and you know, I have to be honest, my friend is here and he knows this. I walked away from God and my faith at age 13. I had my bar mitzvah, quit, walked away. I was sick of the hypocrisy that I saw starting at about age 9. I'm not going to go into details. I walked away from my faith. Now, I built Shroud.com and I started lecturing on the Shroud, and people started asking me, what do you believe? They're not talking about the Shroud anymore, they're talking about faith. And I'm going, oh, I don't know what I believe. And I've been to more masses than a lot of my Catholic friends. I've looked for God in all these other places. And yet, I never felt close to God. And then one day, wanting to be honest with people, I sat myself down and I said, look, what do you believe? Look inside yourself. And when I looked inside myself, remembering I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home with my grandparents there, we followed all the rules and dietary rules and everything. And when I looked inside, I found God had been there all along, just waiting for me to acknowledge him. And I said that to a priest friend of mine, and he just smiled and said, Jesus said that too. He said, the kingdom of God is within us. I've just been looking in the wrong direction all those years. So how many Jews can say the Shroud of Turin brought them back to their faith in God? I can. And so what is a nut? So here's the answer to the question of what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing so involved with the most important relic of Christianity. Isn't it funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger? I'm just a messenger, folks. Thank you very much. Oh, there you are.
Thank you, Barrie. I think I speak for everyone. We appreciate very much that a Jewish, an expert photographer, gave us a testament to faith and teaching us about our own faith and about the most important relic that we have as a gift from our Lord himself. Thank you. Thank you.